While I am in the process of creating a Werewolf the Apocalypse video that has proven to be my longest video yet, I hope you can enjoy a much shorter video covering another one of my favorite interests. Hello, denizens of the night. Welcome to Carnophage. I am Ignacio Talis, and if there is one multimedia franchise I have an unreasonable amount of commitment to, that would be Resident Evil. I remember my dad and sister trying out a demo of Resident Evil 6 when I was a kid, but my proper initiation came back from when Nightmind was less insufferable, and he made a video about Resident Evil 7. That pushed me to give the series a shot, and 7 would be my first proper experience with Resident Evil. I must have been 13 or 14 at the time. I've played all of the RE Engine games that followed, along with 4, 5, 6, Revelations 1 and 2, and I got filtered by the 2002 remake of the original Resident Evil. I have also seen the 4 animated movies, the Infinite Darkness limited series, familiarized myself with just about every title I haven't played through reputation and research, and I own this little Cerberus plushie. That is my credibility as a Resident Evil enthusiast. However, I want to focus on the future of the series, because even though I started following this franchise in the middle of what was undoubtedly a reboot of sorts, which should have made it the perfect starting point, I can't help but feel a little disoriented. So let's say that Resident Evil 7 is the new starting point, as it was for me, and nothing really stands out except for the references that I can understand by reputation. The Trevor and Chamberlain company that designed the House of Puzzles ties to the Trevor family, the article by Alyssa Ashcroft, Chris Redfield showing up at the end, and whatever else. I wasn't very acquainted much with the previous games, but I did understand that Chris looked very different from his recent appearances, which would be corrected in Village, but one thing at a time. Remakes for 2 and 3 released in the following years, presumably to reacquaint the player base with the Raccoon City incident, along with its star characters, and I kind of see the vision here. It is one of the most important parts of the entire narrative that is also significant to the identity of those characters. It would be kind of hard for a fan who has only played 7 and Village to understand who Leon is when getting into Resident Evil Requiem, or even care if he's just known by reputation. So, to fill people in and push the franchise forward in regards to gameplay as well, we get remakes of 2 and 4. That is probably why the remake of Resident Evil 3 feels like the odd one out, and I agree with the perspective that it was designed with a lot less care than the other remakes. It is played off as a side story to another saga, with the remakes of 2 and 4 along with Requiem. That's like our Leon trilogy, one of the 2 more or less complete character arcs for these new games. Leon took the events at Raccoon City the hardest compared to Claire or Jill, and Resident Evil Requiem is his literal requiem for the lives he wishes he could have saved, an idea restated in the 4 remake, either in how the intro cutscene is completely redone, or what he says when he gets Ashley to Luis's lab. It is also Grace's requiem for her mother, but that's neither here nor there. This story that was cooked up for Leon in the recent years does overwrite his characterization in the original Resident Evil 4, but is at least in line with how he was portrayed in Resident Evil 6, and has remained consistent in the recent games with evolution between titles. I, personally, have more reasons to like Leon Kennedy now, but where does that leave everyone else? Well, Leon wasn't the only character that got a redo with the recent games. I actually can't say much about Claire Redfield in the remakes because I don't think she's changed that much from her previous appearances I know her from, which would be Degeneration, Darkside Chronicles, and Revelations 2. I do particularly like her depiction in the 2 remake, largely because of her voice actor and her time with Annette and Sherry Birkin. I'm not a huge fan of her character design as seen in the 2 remake, but I can live with that. I'll also take the opportunity to mention that Chris in Not a Hero and Village feels mostly in line with previous depictions, bar the very weird writing in Village. That is a can of worms, but I'm sure that you know what I'm talking about if you played the game. Jill Valentine is a more peculiar case, as her previous stoic badass demeanor is changed to a more harsh and headstrong personality. To some extent, this is depicted as her way of coping with the Spencer Mansion incident and her situation in the 3 remakes, such as having to work together with Carlos, whom she has little reason to trust. However, this personality is also kept in her portrayal in Death Island, but the similar excuse is present as she's mentally recovering from her time under Wesker's control. Will we ever see a somewhat moderate personality for a Jill Valentine that has more or less made peace with the Spencer Mansion incident and Wesker's mind control? I don't know. I didn't really enjoy her in the 3 remake, and she's okay in Death Island, so I'm not sure if I really care all that much, but I would rather care than not. In a way, I can understand the intention of changing her personality this much, because now Chris, Leon, Claire, and Jill all act very differently from one another. I can also see that Jill has changed in such a way that it's not as easy to see her and Chris as a duo when they were the original duo, but it sort of works in Death Island. And good lord, I've rarely seen anything that makes Chris and Claire feel believable as siblings. Anyways, Jill's changes still feel kind of odd, and I don't feel like I have a good grasp on it yet, which absolutely was not helped by how much was cut out of the 3 remake. I do really love Carlos though in that game. You can't redo a character like that just so I can never see him again. Oh well. Speaking of changes to minor characters, that's where changes get a lot more profound even compared to Jill. Throughout the remakes, everyone is changed in such a way that they still meet the same conclusions. Dead characters remain dead, and whatnot, with one exception. Nikolai Zinoviev from Resident Evil 3 has been flipped to work against Umbrella, and a lot of emphasis is put on his mysterious employer. With context from Grace's report in Requiem, I can safely speculate that Nikolai was working for the Connections, which had an interest in destroying Umbrella so they could sift through the corpse of the company. So, I guess if you've played the original Resident Evil 3 and not the remake, you would understandably think that this new detail came from nowhere. If you didn't play 3 but you did play Resident Evil 6, then you might have been caught off guard by, well, Leon is still in the DSO along with Sherry, but Simmons is never mentioned in Requiem when it was stated that he was responsible for the destruction of Raccoon City. That action is attributed to the Connections, and yet the family, along with the assassination of Adam Benford, are still also mentioned in Requiem. Have you ever heard of a story having a twist for the sake of just having one? This whole thing with the Connections was obviously crammed into a plot that absolutely did not have them in mind. I know that I sound a little frustrated here, and that's probably not earned by me as someone who's only been into this franchise for 9 years when it's nearly 30 years old. I perhaps do not qualify for longtime fan status, but during those 9 years I invested myself in some of the previous games. I played what I could, researched what I couldn't get through, and yet Capcom seems to only care about what came out after 2016. And I know that these games rarely ever have excellent stories and are generally in popcorn entertainment territory, but there is still such a thing as bad popcorn entertainment. I don't think it's wrong for me to want to feel something when playing these games. The plots can be questionable and silly, which is exactly what I've come to expect, but I know that these stories can also be exciting and charming. Resident Evil 4 and its remake are both deeply unserious, but have basically perfect stories to support their experiences, while Village is a lot more serious and has a story that is flawed in some very jarring ways. It's not like 4 or any of its predecessors have technically complicated stories, and it is ridiculous to think that Capcom's current writers can't reach those quote-unquote heights again. Well, at least most of the previous games go on sale pretty regularly, so we can all get our fix of Resident Evil at extraordinarily low prices, even if they are rarely of narrative consequence anymore. Unfortunately, almost all of the spin-off titles and anything that came out prior to 2002 have been unavailable on most platforms until very recently. GOG was the exception for the pre-2002 games, and in October of 2025, the senior business developer of GOG, Marcin Pagzinski, spoke of his effort to get the original versions of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 on his platform.
one of the people that were spearheading the project within GOG, like convincing Capcom that, because that was actually their main counter-argument when we were trying to bring back the classic games. They were like, okay, we have all of those remakes. It's already like superior experience, right, to those games. So they didn't really see the value in bringing back the classical versions, the vanilla ones. It took a lot of convincing that, hey guys, there is an audience that has a lot of memories about those games, right? And they would love to be able to experience exactly the same game again, right? And so thankfully we were able to convince them. They trust us into, working on one of their biggest IPs, if not the biggest.
That is as unfortunate as it is unsurprising. However, it does explain the thought process behind inserting a little retcon here and there for the remakes. If the remake is somehow superior, then its narrative can supplant whatever came before. It's crazy to think that the people who were hooked from the very beginning are probably now in their 40s or 50s, but there are still plenty who got into those games later and invested themselves in them. It's a little cold that Capcom seems interested in paving over these past entries for something as, quite frankly, arbitrary as being technically surpassed. If you look at horror cinema and the many remakes that technically surpassed their predecessors, then this idea evidently becomes far more unreasonable. It is a little encouraging that the first two games have come back, at least on Steam, but it's hard to get Capcom's initial reservations out of my head. It's also a little confusing as the changes aren't even just focused on the pre-2002 games. I do like most of the new characterizations we get in the Resident Evil 4 remake, but again, Requiem retcons some of the stuff from Resident Evil 6. Perhaps the game's comparatively poor reception makes it safer to retcon. That also feels like we might never see Jake Miller ever again, even if we got a post-RE6 Sherry, which is fine by me. Honestly, I lose more sleep over how Sherry was depicted in Requiem than the thought of never seeing Jake again. If Resident Evil 5 ever does get remade, perhaps this combination of the general interest in changing the story and its mixed reception will mean that its story will be far more edited than what we saw for Resident Evil 4. What that entails, I don't really know. As for the Revelations games, which I doubt will ever be remade, I have very little confidence we will hear much of anything from their plotlines. But at least Alex Wesker wasn't completely forgotten. She showed up in one of the multiplayer spin-offs that Capcom quickly moved on from. I won't get to whatever was going on in the first Revelations game because I know I played that game, I have the achievement and everything, but I couldn't tell you a goddamn thing that happened in that game. Either way, nothing that happened in these games, which are still very modern, is going to be of any consequence in the next proper Resident Evil game. Perhaps the 20-something Natalia Corda turned Alex Wesker has a big position in the connections, but that's probably it. I couldn't care less if that turns out to be true, but I know some people really like Alex Wesker. So, because of this practice of just ignoring whatever might have happened before 7, the franchise enters its 30-year anniversary and it feels like it's only been around for not even half that amount of time. No game before 7 actually matters for the story that is currently being told because it can change on a whim, so long as remakes still sell well, which they will. And if there's people who want to play the pre-2002 games, they can kick rocks because they might not be interested in the new titles that can be sold for $60 or $70. It's a little frustrating because even with the remakes and their changes, we aren't telling fresh stories. My interest in something like a Code Veronica remake is held back a lot because I know how that story will end. I could probably also predict how we would get to that ending as well, even with an obligatory change here and there. Rumors have it that there will be remakes for Code Veronica and Zero in the future. The former likely laying the groundwork for a remake of 5, and the latter will probably have some stuff about the connections inserted into it. The mentions of a Brandon Bailey in Village and Requiem, a character who was introduced in the files of Resident Evil 5, along with the dramatic focus on the Wesker stuff in the 4 remake, also leads me to believe that a 5 remake is somewhere in the agenda. That's 3 different games, and I'm sure they will be fine, but unless the reveal is extremely anticlimactic, I am magnitudes more interested in the 10th mainline Resident Evil game than any remake. At the very least, these remakes are kinda fun and interesting, while the mainline titles have been a blast in their own right. even if the Resident Evil games are yet to wholly shake off the problems with their third acts. The original Resident Evil 4 was my favorite of the series, a real formative piece of art for me, but I've replayed its remake enough that it might be my new favorite. The 3 remake is far more underwhelming than it is terrible, and it's still very overpriced, while the 2 remake is a solid piece of survival horror. Unfortunately, it's still hard to look at them as complete with how much has been taken out of them from the originals. I still hold 7 very close to my heart, and I love its grounded, almost grindhouse style. Village is certainly flawed, perhaps more so than 7, but I find it more enjoyable to play through, and the gothic aesthetics mixed with classic horror movie influences make it one of the most unique mainline entries. 7 and Village also told the story of a new protagonist with Ethan Winters, which I liked at least in the broad strokes. I can't say much about Shadow of the Rose because it didn't grab me when I tried it out, but from looking at a playthrough of it, I know, get your jokes in, I can at least say that Ethan's characterization in it is actually really good, and it's nice to see a character arc concluded in the years since Resident Evil 7. He's just far more interesting to talk about and ponder than to actually experience though. I just really wish he got to meet Grace Ashcroft. And now I can really talk about Requiem, the latest entry, and an impressive display of combining the action and survival horror identities of the Resident Evil franchise. The off-the-walls action for Leon feels very earned after going through the remakes of 2 and 4, while Grace is put through a lot of physical and emotional peril, which adds to her proper survival horror experience. Victor Gideon is equally sinister and bombastic, which makes him like a perfect Resident Evil villain, but he's used far too sparingly. Story-wise, there are a lot of small awkward pieces regarding the conspiracy that drives the plot. Going to the ruins of Raccoon City, which still has zombies, and discovering yet another secret lab is the kind of plot you write when you're dangerously close to running out of ideas, but it is thematically very strong. Leon and Grace's pursuit to honor the dead is as powerful for me as Ethan's wrathful devotion to rescuing his daughter. Another interesting parallel between Village and Requiem is that the stories put the characters so close to failure that it makes you really want to root for our unlikely heroes. Leon doubting himself also hits pretty hard in this game, and perhaps the remakes making the events that define him fresher in our memory helps his story have as much weight as that of Grace's. I can talk about the gameplay, which is solid but a notable step down from previous games when it comes to being a cohesive experience. However, this video is about the narrative. I have already talked about how it reveals the connections as being something present throughout the entire timeline of Resident Evil. I also want to mention the rather unique depiction of Oswald Spencer in this game, as someone who felt remorse and adopted a young Grace. Here's my take on this. I read the cutscene where this is revealed as him being remorseful for Raccoon City, but not for anything else. He perceives himself as evil, a necessary one perhaps, which is why he passed the Grace on to someone else. It's also very easy to read this as him giving away someone the connections we're after to someone random but resourceful. I have seen many people say that this depiction of him is in conflict with his depiction in Resident Evil 5, but the cutscene people are talking about shows him as only lamenting that he lost his opportunity to become a god due to Raccoon City and Umbrella's downfall. That does not really contradict with anything we see in Requiem. Lastly, I want to talk about what Requiem and the rumored remakes mean for the future of the story. Requiem features less than typical T-virus troubles, as the Connections has created a strain of the virus that can preserve the intelligence of the infected. At first, it's all fun and games on Rhodes Hill with infected workers trying to go about their jobs. But we see in Raccoon City how they can operate advanced weaponry. If we connect the dots and consider that there is a long history for intelligent T-virus-based BOWs that could follow simple commands such as the Tyrants, we might also conclude that the individual sent to hunt for Grace during the flashback was infected with this unique strain of the T-virus. Due to the greater conspiracy of the Connections operating at high levels of the US government, and a quick moment in the opening cutscene where we see that the US has withdrawn from a treaty prohibiting the use of BOWs, This actually gives us our answer on what was revealed at Sienna Village, the BOW infantry that is in use by the BSAA. That is a result of corruption by the Connections and how Requiem pushes the overarching story forward. As for what the remakes are doing, I mentioned how the ones for 2 and 4 made Leon's story fresher in our minds, which might have helped the story in Requiem hit a little harder. Perhaps we haven't seen more of Claire and Jill in the new mainline games, because Capcom doesn't feel confident in what new stories can be told with these characters that feel unique to them. The remakes and animated movies might give them an idea as to what they want to do with those characters while also getting audience feedback. It can also cement character direction, so inconsistency between entries isn't a problem. This is why I wouldn't be surprised if we see Claire pop up in a mainline entry after a Code Veronica remake. I do feel kind of worried that Jill might be at a disadvantage, because her mainline appearances are in 1, 3, and 5, and Capcom has done nothing to give her a supporting role in the new mainline entries. If I am correct, it's a little frustrating that this unnecessary practice is being done, and as I've said before, I would rather Capcom just make fresh new entries, but I don't want to repeat myself. From what it looks like, the remakes will ease us into returning legacy characters for the mainline entries. The future of the Resident Evil franchise is probably what we've already seen before, with a few remakes and a mainline stuffed in between them, which will likely be Code Veronica and Zero, as those help with refining Claire and Rebecca, the latter of whom we have not actually seen in any game as a protagonist since the original Zero. The two also focus on Umbrella's past, so it can plant seeds for connection stuff that can be addressed in the next mainline game. This is probably also why we won't see a 5 remake in a while. It's unlikely that anything that happens in such a game would influence anything in a mainline entry. As for what might happen in the 10th Resident Evil game, Chris will probably be in the spotlight, and Leon might have a supporting role given the cliffhanger Requiem ends on. Claire might also be featured to some capacity, working off the back of the 2 remake, a Code Veronica remake, and to a lesser extent Revelations 2. I do feel a little nervous for what might be done with Jill, but the lack of a possible remake for her might push Capcom to just put her in a mainline entry anyway and skip the remake shit. If we are very lucky, Rebecca might get a supporting role. She is probably the perfect radio character like Sherry or Hunnigan, but for Chris and Jill, however, that's not to say I would mind her being a protagonist. Rumors have it that she almost was for a cancelled game, and I doubt they will leave everything from those cancelled projects to waste. As a general principle though, I wouldn't mind some characters being one-offs, such as Ethan, who resolved his story in 2 games. I wouldn't mind hearing from Grace in a future game, but I can live with never playing as her again. That's kind of how I also feel about Rebecca and Sherry, who was playable in 6. It's also important for this franchise that if we aren't going to explore stories set in the past, we need new strong leads. That could be Grace, but she's not really fit to be our new Leon Kennedy or Chris Redfield, and her story thematically concludes with Requiem. Regardless of whoever enters the fray, the jaws are tightening around the Connections. We will definitely see some new villains, however Nikolai might be brought out of the fridge, and that might be a reason for Jill to be brought into a new mainline game. That is as much as I can confidently say for the future Resident Evil. And I think I've gotten my frustrations with the recent stuff from this franchise laid out on the table. I might feel kind of angst in between entries, but I have plenty of reasons to have faith in them being at least enjoyable. I hope you have enjoyed this breakdown of what's going on with this messy little franchise. You can subscribe for more nonsense on the spooky to strange spectrum, or follow my Blue Sky for irregular updates on videos, unrelated projects, and misadventures. I have been Ignacio Vitalis, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a very sanitary rest of your day.